Thank you very much. Thank you, Sadie, and hello everyone, and thank you to ChemLinks for the invitation to deliver this webinar on plain English allergen labelling in Australia and New Zealand, which is referred to as PEAL. The webinar will outline the new allergen labelling requirements for food sold at retail in Australia and New Zealand. So I'm Janine Curll, the Regulatory Manager in the Australian Ashbury team. I've worked for Ashbury for over 4 years and have been in the food labelling regulatory space for around 20 years. I worked for the New South Wales Food Authority as an enforcement officer for many years, investigating and prosecuting serious food law breaches in New South Wales. I have a PhD on Australia's food regulatory system and the prevention of food fraud as a food health and safety risk. After a brief introduction to Ashbury, the webinar will firstly go over the basic PEAL requirements before discussing common errors on artworks. I'll finish the webinar by discussing some differences between the Australian allergen requirements and requirements in the USA, EU and Great Britain. Ensuring legal compliance with PEAL, which is mandatory, as Sadie said, mandatory for all foods for the sale placed on the shelf from the 24th of February 2024, is arguably the most important aspect of food labelling compliance. Allergen non-compliance on food for sale is the most common reason for FSANZ, or the Food Standards Australia New Zealand coordinated recalls, at 47% of all FSANZ coordinated recalls in 2023. So it's very important, because when there are labelling issues concerning allergens, recalls and withdrawals often follow. So just a little bit about Ashbury. We were founded with a clear vision to give retailers and manufacturers complete confidence in the compliance of their product information and are dedicated to helping consumers make safe and informed choices. We're a regulatory, technical and training consultancy specialising in multi-category and multi-country labelling and compositional compliance of food and other products. We don't just do food, we do other products as well. We cover over 80 countries, speak over 35 languages, and to date we have completed over 200,000 projects. Our headquarters are located in central London, and we have satellite offices in Washington, DC in the USA and in Melbourne in Australia. Our global reach allows us to collaborate with clients in their own time zones and deliver trustworthy advice from local experts who know the relevant languages and law. So what is PEAL, or plain English allergen labelling? The aim of the new allergen labelling framework for packaged foods sold at retail in Australia and New Zealand is to improve the allergen communication for consumers. The changes aim to make allergen declarations consistent, clearer and easier to read and understand. The allergen changes were introduced into Australia and New Zealand law via an amendment to the Australian and New Zealand Food Standards Code, specifically Standard 123, back in February 2021. Deadline for compliance with PEAL compliant requirements was the 25th of February this year, 25th of February last year, 2024. That means all food placed on the shelf from that date now must be compliant with the new requirements. Stock in trade permissions continue for foods placed on the market before 25th of February for another 2 years to 25th of February 2026. So that means that if a product was has a best before date beyond 2 years and was placed on the market, or up to within those 2 years and placed on the market before the 25th of February 2004, then it's compliantly sold. Foods that fall into two categories are exempt. These are foods for special medical purposes and special medical purpose products for infants. Labels on products in these categories must continue to declare allergens with existing declarations. Now, PEAL does not incorporate precautionary allergen labelling, known as PEAL, PEAL remains voluntary statements important for consumers with allergies. And as just mentioned, PEAL applies only to retail sale of packaged foods, a food required to bear a label, not business-to-business sales. So where ingredient lists are provided in a voluntary way on a label that doesn't, and it's a business-to-business sale, not retail, there's no requirement for these PEAL requirements. Note that PEAL does not apply to non-food regulated products like complementary medicines in Australia or therapeutic dietary supplements in New Zealand. It's specifically for products, i.e. food, that is regulated by the Food Standards Code in Australia and New Zealand. If one of the allergens requiring declaration is present in a food, even as a carryover, then the allergen must be declared. The VITAL program provides a good approach for assessing whether the allergen must be declared and contains or the PEAL, the precautionary allergen statement, like the may contains or may be present if it's a VITAL statement. We recommend that food businesses use the VITAL program for assessing their risks for the purposes of allergen labelling. So what are the legal requirements in Australia and New Zealand? There are three main categories of compliance that Ashbury have assessed this change of law as. We've got terminology, format, and location. The location of the allergen information on the label is relative to the statement of ingredients. The terminology is about the actual names of the words used to communicate the specific actual allergen. And the format of the allergen declarations, not only in declaring the allergens in the statement of ingredients, but the format of the summary statement, or otherwise known as the contained statement. So first, let's take a closer look at the required location of the allergen label, allergen information under the PEAL requirements. The allergenic ingredients must be declared using the prescribed required names in brackets following the ingredient. The allergens of processing aids must now be declared at the end of the statement of ingredients in brackets after the words processing aid. You'll see that as an example in the green box here. The summary statement must be distinctly separate. So the contained statement must be distinctly separate from the ingredients list and directly next to it with no other words. Note how the summary statement, i.e. the contained statement, which is in orange, can be on top, below, and or to either side of the ingredients list. It doesn't matter where it is directly next to the ingredient list, but it must be directly next to, as well as being distinctly separate from. No other words should be in this summary statement, such as and, or even allergens from other jurisdictions. Only the words contains and those required names that we will talk to in another future slide. The second category of compliance for PEAL is the format. Here is a simple illustration of the required names in bold in an example statement of ingredients. Note the bolded required names distinctly contrast with the other words in the statement of ingredients. The size of the text of the bolded words are no smaller than the other text. Note, however, that there is no minimum size requirement for the statement in the Food Standards Code. The previous general requirement that the text on the label be legible still applies in regards to sizing. Note the processing aid declaration at the end. And the formatting of the summary statement is now prescribed, as indicated here, but there is no requirement for the box that's just used in this illustration. Finally, the third compliance requirement concerns the terminology that must be used. So only the prescribed required names listed in Schedule 9 of the Australian New Zealand Food Standards Code can be used in the statement of ingredients and summary statement. The actual allergens to declare are the same as before the PEAL amendments. No changes have been made in this regard. There have been changes to the actual names to be used in some instances. So, for example, soy lecithin had to be declared previously and still must be declared in compliance with PEAL. Here are those names required for the PEAL compliance. See that there are some differences between the declarations permitted for the ingredients list and the summary statement. For example, we have the requirement for wheat to be in bold in the statement of ingredients, but it's actually wheat and gluten that's declared in the contained statement. The gluten is not bolded in the ingredient list. The PEAL amendments have introduced changes to labelling required names compared to the pre-PEAL allergen labelling requirements. So, like I just indicated, previously tree nuts could be used to declare the presence of any kind of tree nut in the food, but this is no longer acceptable. Each individual nut name must be used when declaring the type of nut in the statement of ingredients. Sorry, mind my dog, sorry. There are 9 different types of required names for tree nut declaration: almond, Brazil nut, cashew, hazelnut, macadamia, pecan, pine nut, pistachio, and walnut. Please note that the legislation explicitly provides that plural or singular required names are acceptable to achieve PEAL compliance. For example, you can say peanut or peanuts, pecans or pecan. You've also got different requirements for the soybean, explicitly indicating now that you can have it as soybean, soya, or soy or soya. Now I will turn to some real-world PEAL examples that I've just found on the shelf, and I can demonstrate some of where some of those compliance elements have been made out or not. The first one is a compliant ingredients list. It has the allergens bold and same text size, or in fact the requirement is that it's not any smaller, but it's the same text size as the others, which is compliant, and the allergens are in bold. The summary statement distinctly separate from the statement of ingredients. You'll see that you have the a space here, may contain tree nuts, and then you've got a characterizing ingredient statement just underneath, and that is fine, because you'll note here that there's a may contain tree nuts in the PEAL statement, and that is fine because, as we'd indicated earlier, the may contain, or the PEAL precautionary allergen labelling, is not within the scope of PEAL. So it's acceptable as a voluntary statement to use the old terminology of tree nuts. The requirement to identify and bold barley is in the statement of ingredients, but then it's declared correctly as gluten in the contained statement. And as indicated earlier, the contained statement, or rather the there doesn't need to be bolded. That there's no regulation around the may contain or the PEAL. The may contain PEAL precautionary allergen labelling doesn't actually get regulated at all by the Food Standards Code. Or it's regulated by more of a liability, safety concern for companies to make sure that consumers are aware that there could be a chance of an allergen in the food. This is something that is risk assessed, and as I indicated before, the VITAL program is recommended for businesses to assess their risk and determine what the appropriately required statement is and what level is to be declared. So this is a perfectly fine label, as is this one as well. We have the bold in the same size. We have just different ways of the ingredients has been set out a little bit differently here, but that's fine. And we have the bolding of the required allergens, and then we have the wheat, gluten, soy in the contains, which is the summary statement at the bottom. Yes, this for the soybean oil, if it's been proven that that's been refined to the point where there is no soy, then you don't need to. That's that's the carryover exemption that we've already had in Schedule 9. That still carries. However, if it's not soybean oil, but if it's actually the lecithin, then emulsifier, then you actually are adding soy. It's just in a trace amount, so that has to be declared as any other soy ingredient. And the may contain here the PEAL, milk, sesame, fish, and crustacean. That is actually using the correct terminology, the required names, and the may contain. But as I said, that's regulated by the Food Standards Code, so there's a lot more room with the may contain statement. There's no specific requirement. And here, again, perfectly set out format, terminology, and location with all those elements met. Now here's an example of a non-compliant label because of here between the statement of ingredients and the summary statement or the contains milk soy statement, there's actually the required warning. But as we saw with our set out for the format, the contain statement must be directly next to and distinct from the statement of ingredients. So it's not directly next to the statement of ingredients, and therefore this does not meet the new PEAL requirement. And again, we have correct actual declaration in the statement of ingredients, and we have the correct bolding and the sizing. And you see soy lecithin is compliantly declared there. Tree nuts are being used in the may contain, which is fine. It doesn't need to have the required names of one of the 9 nut allergens because it's a PEAL statement. But that warning should just be printed elsewhere. It can be printed underneath the may contain statement or elsewhere on the label. Now with this one, we have allergens bold and same-sex size. We have the summary statement contains milk not distinctly separate from and doesn't meet the requirement for the no other words because it contains milk. Is following the continuation of the statement of ingredients, and it should be on a new line. And also it does have a full stop. However, the word store is next to milk, and the statement in a real conservative interpretation of the requirement for no other words. Ashbury recommend not to have other words following the contain statement. So contain should be on a new line, and then there's following instructions here for the store between, and those various storage compliance requirements should be elsewhere underneath. And here we have bread that has a few, definitely has a few non-compliance issues. The word wheat is not bolded. We have oats not bolded in the statement of ingredients. Wheat containing gluten must be mentioned as 2 allergens on the label in the summary statement. So we have allergens, which is actually, this has been formatted incorrectly as well in the terminology. It should read contains wheat gluten, and the allergens is actually spelled wrong anyway, but that should also contain wheat in the contained statement. It's okay in regards to its format, in that the summary statement isn't directly underneath or directly next to the statement of ingredients. However, as I said, it's lacking the full declaration of wheat. This is an imported chocolate, but it has an over sticker, and on the required PEAL statement of ingredients, milk is not actually bolded as it should be after the whey powder. Actually, whey has got a spelling error as well. It says power instead of powder. The contained statement is formatted correctly in that it's directly next to the statement of ingredients, and that's fine. It's fine to have the cocoa no less than 30% before the may contain traces of tree nuts, wheat and gluten, because as I've said before, the may contain PEAL is not actually within scope for PEAL. Then we'll end on a compliant label, and you'll see that the use of plural pistachios, it could have been pistachio or pistachios, that's fine, and its summary statement is distinctly separate from, but directly next to, the ingredients list. Now I'll just take a little change from the labels, and we'll have a look at some different jurisdictional labelling requirements. So one of the most important things to recognise when thinking of exporting food to multiple markets is that substances and ingredients that are deemed allergenic, yes, to a population, and any food allergen labelling requirements will be different. So this slide is a very brief illustration of a couple of the differences. These are not totally exhaustive lists. These comparative slides just some summaries, so I wouldn't use these as any kind of authoritative kind of material for determining the labelling requirement for a product in the US or Great Britain or the EU. But I've just wanted to demonstrate that there are differences, and it just illustrates a couple of those differences you might encounter. So some allergens that are outlined in PEAL in Australia may not necessarily be deemed allergenic food ingredients in other markets, and that's definitely the case here. We have several important markets where we can compare that. In the USA, lupin, mollusks, sulfites, barley, rye and oats and pine nuts are not allergens in the USA. And similarly in Hong Kong and Singapore, lupin, mollusks, sulfites, sesame and pine nuts are not allergens. But in the Great Britain and in the EU, the only difference with Australia's list of allergens is that pine nuts are not allergens in Great Britain or the EU. So particularly interesting is in the United States of America, where cereals containing gluten such as barley, rye and oats are not grouped along with wheat varieties as allergenic. And this is potentially due to the wording of the legislation in the US, the Food Allergen Labelling and Consumer Protection Act of 2004. In the European Union and Great Britain, the law, the Food Information for Consumers Regulation, says that food to which people may be intolerant, as well as allergenic, must be highlighted on the labelling of the food. So also important to note when considering your allergen and allergen labelling is the changing nature of guidance and regulation across markets. Keeping ahead of changes is vital. For example, in the United States, the FDA guidance recently updated this month in respect of allergenic ingredients labelling. And in Great Britain, which is part of the United Kingdom consisting of England, Scotland and Wales without Northern Ireland, consultation was launched last year in respect of possible changes to the way precautionary allergen labelling might look. Now, PEAL summary statements, so the contained statement in Australia and New Zealand, can be easily confused with precautionary allergen labelling statement, PEAL, which are used on food labelling in the EU and Great Britain, that alert consumers to the fact that the presence of an allergenic food cannot be ruled out completely, i.e. there's a possibility of some contamination. Now, I'll illustrate this on another slide, but you'll note that there's some tricky instances when we compare these different jurisdictional requirements where we can potentially get a little bit confused in what is required. I just wanted to make the point that foods exported to Australia and New Zealand can have a harmonised packaging as long as the required information for Australia and New Zealand is set out along with the information for other territories, as long as the other territory information does not contradict or negate the required Australian and New Zealand information for allergens. So if we just look at a compliant Great Britain food label, we note that the law in Great Britain relating to food information for consumers is derived almost entirely from European food labelling law. So food labels on packaged foods sold in Great Britain look like those in the EU. Here we have an English language label for pre-packed food showing good food allergen information. Note there is no summary statement, contained statement. The required allergen advice signpost is there, but allergens should not appear on that line, only in the body of the ingredients list, bolded in each instance. The PEAL statement is also present to convey information on cross-contamination risks, but it is not the same as the PEAL statement. Confusingly, though, PEAL is sometimes referred to as the may contain statement. This must be added and only added if you cannot rule out allergenic foods present in food, but it must be risk assessed, as I've indicated earlier. So where on the Australian New Zealand labels, the allergen advice for allergens statement here would be where we would require the contained statement or the summary statement that contains the bolded milk, egg. Turning now to the US, there are 3 options for food allergen listing in the US. And this slide shows 2 of these ways of presenting food allergen information for pre-packed foods. Please be aware, however, that the individual state laws may also apply. Like I said, this is not exhaustive in regards to the compliance of these countries' labels. And this is an example taken from the FDA site about the Food Allergen Labelling and Consumer Protection Act of 2004. You can see that unlike Australia and New Zealand and the EU and Great Britain, foods sold in the US do not require allergens in bold or underlying the name of the allergenic food ingredient, and depending on the option applied, a contained statement, or the summary statement as we refer to it in PEAL, is not mandatory. This is the 3rd option in the US. Again, there's no bolding or highlighting used, and also no contained statement equivalent to the US PEAL contained statement. You can see that, like in the EU and Great Britain, it is possible to use an allergen advisory statement equivalent to a may contains or PEAL statement. But as with the EU and Great Britain, it must be based on a thorough risk assessment and strict allergen controls. Now I'll just turn to some common artwork errors. Including allergens for declaration in other markets, like celery, coconut or mustard. Not bolding all instances of the required names. Say, when we have compound names, say like milk chocolate, and then in brackets you have your sub-ingredients. All instances of milk, including the compound name milk chocolate, should be in bold. And using the old terminology of tree nuts instead of the 9 allergenic nuts. We've been seeing that in the contained statement. Not using the required names, say dairy instead of milk. The required names as of Schedule 9 of the Food Standards Code must be used now. And that's in the ingredient list and in the summary statement. Sometimes there is inconsistency of the size of text between the bolded name in the statement of ingredients and the summary statement. They should be the same. Other information such as characterizing ingredients or warnings before the contained statement, so that the ingredients list is not distinctly separate from the summary. So all these various elements have had different non-compliances as people were working through their labels to get their compliance right. There have been many mistakes on labels, but I think that companies have now been given the time and the dedication in their team to relabel where required to achieve PEAL compliance. So that's the end of the webinar, and I have also prepared an actual reference document, which is a two-page document that is a summary of all the various legal requirements and links, and you'll be able to access those if you request, or we can send them out. And if you contact us at our contact details here on this last slide, or give me a call, that's my number there, and we're very happy to discuss what your business is selling, and for labelling compliance we can help you. So thank you. We'll now have our Q&A session.
Janine, I can see that there is a lot of questions that is in the chat box. Would you like to answer them? Pick some of them to answer.
Where I can find those. Oops. Don't know how to. Stop sharing so I can look at the chat box. Look, I'll go to the. All right, so okay, I'm very sorry that we had no sound at first. Okay, so may I know for the word of contains, is that necessary to be uppercase? No, there's no specific requirement on whether or not it needs to be in upper or lowercase. It just needs to be bolded. That's the requirement, and it needs to be there. Okay. Is the allergen summary statement necessary to be displayed when allergens are mentioned in the list of ingredients? Yes, both of those. That's part of the PEAL requirement now. We have the duplication. So we have the bolded in the actual statement of ingredients, and we have the additional contained statement directly next to the statement of ingredients that repeats all those bolded required names, allergens. PEAL does not need to be bolded. Okay, so I ask Yes, I think I answered that question in regards to refined soybean oil. If it meets the actual specific exemption in Schedule 9, then it does not need to be declared if it's been refined and demusked. How about if my ingredient is gluten instead of cereal containing gluten? Can I directly label as gluten? Yes. Yes, that's if the actual ingredient is gluten. Yes, indeed. That's how you. Can I use stickering for imported product? Yes, as long as the sticker doesn't cover anything that's important and information required for compliance in Australia and New Zealand. And that information must not contradict or negate any information that's in the other language potentially on the label. Pine nuts are listed in the FDA guidance for industry. Okay. Yes. Yeah, are listed. If a business-to-business product voluntarily declared allergens on packaging, is it mandatory to use required names? For example, allergen cereals containing gluten instead of contains gluten. Well, the requirement when selling business to business is to actually provide the information, any information and all information that will allow the end user of that this ingredient to be able to declare the allergens required on their final retail label. So whatever information is necessary for the correct labeling is what you need to be supplying in that sale. It does not need to be it's recommended that the required names are used and that but to the point where it's not contradictory or confusing for that end purchaser who are then going to label their final product with your ingredient. They need to have that information to be able to properly label it according to PEAL. So that's the test, and that's the question that you need to ask. If that information is adequate for them to then adequately declare as per PEAL, then that's fine. Can royal jelly propolis be included in the PEAL statement? If it is, yes, yes, the PEAL is a voluntary statement. It's not regulated in any way by the Food Standards Code standards specifically. It's a reliability concern. So people who could be harmed by small traces then are warned. Now, when you have any risk of royal jelly or propolis, you'd need to actually also carry the associated warning statements for those ingredients, but they're not actually allergens for the purpose of this of PEAL, but they do have other mandatory warning statements required, and they can be included in the PEAL as long as it's a compliantly labelled, safely labelled product, so that that's communicated with the warnings. So with barley needs to be declared as barley in the statement of ingredients, but it's mandatory, barley, oats and rye. But when you actually declare that ingredient in the contained statement or the summary statement, it has to be declared as gluten. It's not repeated as barley, oats and rye. It's gluten is the requirement. That's the required name. So when an artwork is intended to multiple countries, including Australia, how do we ensure allergen labelling compliance? Well, there'd need to be a specific ingredients, statement of ingredients, specific contained statement that would be specific for the Australian marketplace, Australian New Zealand marketplace. So you would, you can have additional information. You can have other jurisdictional information. You can have other languages other than English on the label, but there's the legal requirement for that all the information required for Australia has to be in English, and it has to be compliant with the Food Standards Code, and it must not contradict or negate the other information, must not contradict or negate the Australian information. So how do you ensure Australian labelling compliance? Well, you have to either oversticker if that label is not actually, if that Australian information is not actually present already, and it has to be on an oversticker with the other required information in addition to the allergen requirements, but other labelling aspects for compliance has to be on the over sticker for compliant sale. So I'm sorry, I missed your message regarding PEAL application on dietary supplements in New Zealand. Is PEAL mandatory for dietary supplements? PEAL is only mandatory for the standards that are listed in the Food Standards Code. It only applies within the Food Standards Code. So a therapeutic dietary supplement, no. Any other dietary supplements, I know that there's some changes to legislation in New Zealand. Anything that's outside the Standards Code, it doesn't actually apply. It's only within any food. It's defined as a product that's defined as a food, or any of the various special categories at in chapter 2 of the Food Standards Code, or and also doesn't apply to complementary medicines in Australia or any other products that don't need to comply with the Food Standards Code. So it's specifically within the scope of the Food Standards Code. I hope that answers your question. Is there any concern if the word ingredients at the start of ingredient listed is bolded? Well, in some supermarkets are actually refraining from bolding the ingredients, just to be have a very conservative application of the requirements. However, that's not actually something that's necessarily required, not in the legal in the legal text, but it's also not required in the legal guidance documents that have come from FSANZ. FSANZ's own examples often have ingredients in bold at the start of the list. The word is required, obviously, but it does not need to be in bold. And if it is in bold, then it hasn't been raised as an issue by the regulators. Hi, the amendment PEAL, not allowed to state PEAL. Is this correct? It's not about not allowed. You have to, if there's a risk to a consumer from a trace from cross contamination, a trace allergen, then that must be on the food product for it to be a safe product safely labeled product. So, but the point is that PEAL is not captured by the PEAL requirements. So when you make a precautionary allergen labelling statement, like may be present or may contain, or also there are other configurations of warnings, say made in a factory or stored on a premises where other allergens are maintained. Those statements are all voluntary statements, precautionary allergen labelling statements, and they don't need to be PEAL compliant. They can also they can use the word tree nuts because it's not captured. If gluten is declared, is it okay to remain barley in contained statement? Well, the requirement is the barley is declared as a bold in the statement of ingredients, and that barley is then declared as gluten in the contained statement, because that's the allergenic component. So that's the requirement, is to not have barley in contained, but to actually have it as gluten. That's the legal requirement. Any grace period to include the summary contains? No, unfortunately, it's passed now. This is as implemented. It was introduced in 2021, so there was quite a few years of transition with the regulators advising food businesses and industry of the changes and the expectations for compliance. And then from the 25th of February last year, that was the start date. So if the product isn't actually on the market yet, and it's about to be labelled to be put on the market, it has to comply with PEAL. There's no more grace period. Is it mandatory to declare allergen on the secondary packaging, e.g. the carton package? No, as cartons or shelf-ready trays or distribution cartons, they don't have requirements to actually have the allergens labelled or have the statements repeated on those outer labels, outer packaging. But if that information is provided voluntarily, it has to comply with PEAL. So if there is a shelf-ready tray that has the additional allergen, additional information about the ingredients on that shelf-ready tray, that in that instance, even though it's voluntary, it has to be PEAL compliant. Okay, this is. I'm curious, are the regulations for food and cosmetics the same in both Australia and New Zealand? Yes, well, yeah, in Australia and New Zealand, I can't speak for cosmetics, but in regards to food, it's the Australian New Zealand Food Standards Code. And so when you look through the Food Standards Code, then you will see all the standards that are listed. You'll also note that there are some standards that in brackets would say it does not apply in New Zealand or Australia only. And so there are some differences. There are some additional standards in New Zealand that actually have sit outside the Food Standards Code, but do apply to dietary supplements and very similar food type substances, but manufactured in New Zealand, or sorry, regulated in New Zealand in that way with under a different law. There are some changes there with health products in New Zealand, and they may they sit outside the Food Standards Code. But yes, food, definition of food and food is regulated the same in New Zealand and Australia, generally. The food safety is not. There are definite differences with food safety requirements. It's, in the processing of food between Australia and New Zealand, but for labelling, yes, they're the same apply. Okay, is a summary statement needed for allergens present in alcoholic beverages without a list of ingredients? Is the bold formatting required for allergens on alcoholic beverage labels? Yes, there are no exemptions for alcohol. It's the same, and for compliance with PEAL, and but they don't need the statement of ingredients. Obviously, they have the contains. Is it needed to bold spelt in the ingredient list? No, it's different now. We don't have spelt. It's only barley, oats, or rye. If my packaging has limited space, do I still need to separate the allergen statement from other statements? Yes, we do see that there is some difficulty in the space requirements for some smaller packages. You are advised to try your best to comply, and we will always, Ashbury always recommends that the space is somehow made to meet those requirements. However, we've noticed that in some supermarkets where space is just really prohibitive, and that space differences between and then contain statements might flow from the ingredient list, or but yeah, it's not compliant that way. But you sometimes you might have to speak to a supplier, a retailer, if you are selling your product there, and they can use their discretion based on their own policy of risk as to whether or not they would accept a food that had a label like that. And but as you see, I went through a supermarket only just the other month to get the foods, to get the labels examples that I provided you earlier, and many are non-compliant at the moment. Can you please summarize question and answer issue and share with us by email? Well, I think, yeah, that I could potentially do that. Yes, I think I can do that with, when we also supply our reference document that gives a really good summary of all the requirements. I think that I think that actually covers most of our questions here. But I would definitely look through our questions here and see if I can gather a bit of a theme, some themes, and put some dot points on some extra issues that people have raised. Yes, so if barley and oat variants do not contain gluten, do they need to be bold again? Yes, they do. There's no exemption in law for a different scenario. The ingredient list needs to provide detailed milk, e.g. skim milk, full milk, or just milk is acceptable. Well, when you do declare each ingredient, there's always the requirement to use a common or generic name and to use the actual descriptor of the form in which the ingredient is used. So if it's powdered milk, or if it's and indeed, so skim milk, full milk, it can be taken as being the form, and mostly that's exactly how the best practice is for those different forms of the ingredients or rather the allergens to actually be declared, and in which case you only bold the allergen. So skim milk, full cream milk, it's just the milk that we would bold in the ingredient list, not the whole other descripting or forming words before. Allergens contained allergens contained in the direct food packaging, e.g. Yes. Well, that goes within your assessment of the risk assessment of any allergens. That has to be assessed as also the packaging and any leaching that could potentially occur, or also with the storage. So these are assessed as aspects that are assessed when actually assessing what statements are required and whether or not the required statement is a contain statement or a may contain or may be present statement, depending on the level of risk that is rigorously assessed through the VITAL program. Oh yeah, I think I answered that. How about if my ingredient is gluten instead of cereal containing gluten? Can I directly label as gluten? Yes. And the allergen statement will be gluten. Yes, if that's the ingredient. Well, thank you for your thanks and your feedback. I think oh, here we go. Let me see. I got one last one. How about if this is an original product from a certain country, example US, but we want to export it to Australia, and the allergens are different? Is it required to use a sticker? Yes, you can use over stickers as long as it doesn't oversticker other information. Your oversticker must be with all the information required for Australian market. If we use a sticker and the contents differ from what is stated on the original package, would that be an issue? You have to oversticker the wrong information. So if the ingredient list has different allergen names and whatever else, and just information that is incorrect for Australia, it's best to oversticker the incorrect information when you're overstickering on the package. And that can be a bit tricky sometimes, but you can design the label over stickers in a particular way where it's best placed to cover the incorrect information. Okay, those are all the questions answered. So please go for the poll questions.